All right, welcome back everyone for another deep dive. And today we're really zeroing in on a pretty major cybersecurity threat that's been making waves. It's called Akira ransomware. And we've been digging through a mountain of reports, analysis, all that good stuff to really try to boil it down to what you absolutely need to know about Akira, how it works, why it's such a big deal, and what you can actually do about it.
Yeah, Akira's it's more than just a piece of nasty software floating around the internet. It kind of popped up on our radar, back in March 2023, I'd say. But it quickly became clear this wasn't your typical ransomware. It's more like well, I guess you could say well-organized operation.
Interesting. So it's not just a virus, it's like a whole, what, like a ransomware business or something?
Yeah, I think business might be pushing it a little too far.
Hmm.
But it's definitely not just some lone wolf hacker in a basement, cobbling together code.
Okay.
There's a level of sophistication here that points to a more structured approach.
Okay, so we're talking serious players then. And I keep seeing this term double extortion thrown around. What's the real deal with that? Is it just like they encrypt your files and then ask for more money later? What makes it double?
It's definitely a step beyond just encrypting your data. I mean, that alone is obviously a huge problem. It cripples your operations. You can't access your files. But the double extortion part comes in when they also, well, they've already exfiltrated a copy of your sensitive data. They basically steal it before they lock it up. And then the threat is, if you don't pay the ransom, they're going to release all that data publicly. Think financial records, customer data, trade secrets, the stuff that could really damage your reputation even if you manage to recover from the encryption.
Wow. So they're really hitting you from both sides, operational disruption and then the threat of what, like a reputational nuke, essentially.
Exactly. It's a way to really amp up the pressure and increase the likelihood of victims actually paying.
Makes sense, unfortunately. But how are they even getting it in the first place? I mean, it's not like everyone's just clicking on suspicious links anymore, right? Or are they?
No, you're right. The methods are getting more sophisticated. Akira, in particular, they're really focusing on exploiting compromised credentials. They go after things like VPNs, remote access tools, anything that's exposed to the internet. If those systems aren't properly secured, especially with things like multi-factor authentication, well, it's like leaving the front door wide open for them.
Right, so they're basically finding the unlocked windows, the weak points in your security, and then using stolen keys to just walk right in.
That's a good analogy. It's not always brute force. It's often more about leveraging existing vulnerabilities and stolen credentials to quietly slip in.
And once they're in, I mean, they don't just sit around, right? They're pretty active, aren't they?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Once they gain that initial access, the next stage is what we call lateral movement. They're essentially poking around, trying to map out your network, find more valuable data,
Yeah.
escalate their privileges, basically trying to gain as much control as possible.
It's like a burglar who gets in through one window and then starts trying all the doors in the house to see what else they can get their hands on.
Exactly. They're looking for the good stuff, and they're not afraid to be thorough.
And they're not just using their own custom tools for this, right? I've seen mentions of them using like off-the-shelf software as well.
Yeah, that's another sign of their sophistication.
Hmm.
They utilize a blend of publicly available tools and their own custom malware. Sometimes those publicly available tools, they can be harder to detect because they're used legitimately for things like system administration, but in the wrong hands, they can be just as dangerous as any malware.
So it's a mix of stealth and I guess you could say resourcefulness, right? They're not reinventing the wheel if there's a perfectly good tool already out there that they can abuse.
Right. Why waste time and resources developing something new if you can repurpose something that's already effective?
Makes sense, unfortunately. So let's circle back to that double extortion thing. Can you kind of walk me through how that plays out in a real attack?
Sure. So the first phase, the initial breach and that lateral movement, that's all about establishing a strong foothold in your network. They're identifying the most valuable data, the crown jewels, so to speak.
Hmm.
And then very quietly, they start exfiltrating that data, copying it off your systems and onto their own servers. This can take time. They don't want to raise any alarms. And then once they've got what they want, that's when they trigger the ransomware. It can happen simultaneously, or maybe they wait a little while just to really let the victim think they've maybe dodged a blood, but then boom, everything gets encrypted. And along with the ransom demand, there's the added threat: pay up, or we release all your data.
Talk about adding insult to injury. You're already dealing with a massive disruption, and then they hold this data bomb over your head. Brutal. Now, this level of planning, the way they're operating, it makes me think they're not just some random group that popped up out of nowhere. Are there any known links to other cybercriminal groups?
There are definitely some connections. When you look at the technical details of Akira's attacks, how they do things, the specific tools and techniques they use, there are some overlaps with the very notorious ransomware group called Conti. Conti was a major player for a while, but they kind of went dark, supposedly disbanded. But many analysts believe that some of the key players from Conti might be involved with Akira, bringing their expertise and experience to this new operation.
So it's like a spin-off or a successor or something like that.
Possibly. There are also some reported links to groups known as Gold Sahara and Punk Spider. So it's not just about Conti. It seems like Akira is part of a wider network, a whole ecosystem of cybercriminal groups.
Okay, so we're talking about a family tree of ransomware, I guess?
Mhm.
It's disturbing to think how organized these groups are. Now, let's dig into the specifics a little bit. How are they actually pulling these attacks off? I've seen references to the MIT ATT&CK framework. Can you explain what that is and how it relates to Akira?
Sure. The MIT ATT&CK framework, it's basically it's like a giant encyclopedia of adversary tactics and techniques. It breaks down all the different ways attackers operate, and it gives each one a specific ID, a TID. So when we analyze Akira, we can look at the specific TIDs they're using, and that gives us a much clearer picture of their tactics.
Okay, so it's like like a playbook of cyber attacks, but broken down into specific moves?
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
So what are some of the key TIDs, the moves that really stand out with Akira?
Well, one that jumps out is tfind31, account access removal.
Account access removal, what's that all about?
Basically, what they do is they'll delete administrator accounts on the systems they've compromised. And they often do this before or during the encryption process.
Why would they do that? I mean, isn't that just making more work for themselves later?
Not really. By deleting those accounts, they're making it much harder for the victim to recover without paying the ransom. Even if you manage to get your hands on a decryptor, without those admin accounts, you're going to have a much harder time actually restoring your systems and data.
So it's like they're not just locking the door, they're also taking away your key.
Exactly. It's a way to increase their leverage, make it even more painful for the victim to refuse to pay.
Not cool. What else are they doing?
Another key TID is T1560.001, archive collected data. It sounds complicated, but it's actually pretty simple. It just means they use tools like WinRAR to compress the data they've stolen before they exfiltrate it.
Ah, that makes sense. Compressing it would make it faster to transfer, right?
Right. Smaller file size, quicker transfer. Plus, it might help them evade some detection systems that are looking for large data transfers.
So they're thinking about stealth and efficiency every step of the way. Sneaky.
Then, of course, we have the core of any ransomware attack, T1486, data encryption for impact. That's the part where they actually scramble your data, making it unreadable without the decryption key.
The digital equivalent of locking up all the files in a safe and throwing away the key.
Got it. Now, I noticed they seem to be targeting specific types of data. There's been a lot of talk about SharePoint. Is that a coincidence?
Not at all. The TID T1200 and 2172-02 data from information repositories specifically mentions SharePoint. This tells us they're not just randomly encrypting anything they can find, they're going after the valuable stuff. SharePoint is often used for storing sensitive documents, intellectual property, financial records. It's the crown jewels, and Akira knows it.
So they're doing their research, figuring out where the most sensitive data lives, and then going straight for it. And once they've got it, how do they get it out of the network? What's the TID for that?
That would be T1567.002, exfiltration over web services. Akira has been using a tool called rclone for this.
rclone, isn't that a legitimate tool? I thought people use that for backups and things like that. You're right, rclone itself isn't malicious. It's just a command line tool for syncing files with cloud services.
Yeah.
But because it's legitimate, it can sometimes fly under the radar of security systems. It's another way Akira blends in with normal traffic, making it harder to detect.
So they're not just using hacking tools, they're also hijacking everyday tools and turning them against us. Smart, but scary. Now, speaking of tools, we've mentioned rclone a couple of times. What are some of the other tools they're using in these attacks?
What another key tool is AdFind. It's basically a tool for querying Active Directory. Active Directory is like the central nervous system of many corporate networks. It holds information about users, computers, permissions, the whole structure.
So AdFind is like, what, their reconnaissance tool? They're using it to map out the network before they strike?
Precisely. By understanding the layout of the network, They can identify the most valuable targets, the systems with the highest privileges, the ones that will give them the most control. It's like a blueprint for the attack.
Okay, so it's the planning phase. AdFind help them know where to go and what to hit. What else are they using? I remember seeing something about mimikatz.
Ah, Mimikatz. Now that's a dangerous one. It's a post-exploitation tool, meaning they use it after they've already gained access to a machine. What Mimikatz does is it extracts passwords and other credentials directly from the computer's memory. So if they compromise even one machine, they can use Mimikatz to steal credentials and then use those credentials to log into other systems, move laterally across the network, escalate their privileges.
Oh, wow. So it's like a, what, like a master key that unlocks everything?
Pretty much. It's
Yeah.
one of the most powerful tools in a hacker's arsenal, and it's unfortunately very effective.
So they use AdFind to map the network, mimikatz to steal credentials, and then rclone to get the data out. And of course, there's the ransomware itself. It's a pretty efficient operation.
Sadly, yes, it is.
Okay, so we've got a pretty good understanding of how they get in, how they move around, how they steal data, and how they encrypt everything. Now, the big question, how do we defend against this? What can organizations do to protect themselves from Akira?
Well, like you said, they rely heavily on compromised credentials. So the first and most important step is implementing multi-factor authentication, or MFA.
MFA, yeah, that's basically having two forms of authentication, right? Like a password and then a code from your phone or something like that.
Exactly. It adds an extra layer of security, making it much harder for attackers to gain access, even if they do manage to steal your password.
So MFA on everything, especially anything that can be accessed remotely, that's a must-have. What else?
Given their focus on external remote access points, like VPNs,
Mm.
it's absolutely critical to closely monitor the logs for those systems. Look for anything suspicious. Failed logins, logins from unusual locations, anything that deviates from the normal patterns.
So keep an eye on who's coming and going, basically.
Exactly. Early detection is key.
Right.
If you can spot an intrusion early, you might be able to contain it before they can do too much damage.
Makes sense. What about the network itself? Is there anything we can do to, I don't know, like limit the damage if they do manage to get in?
Absolutely. Network segmentation is crucial. By dividing your network into smaller, isolated segments, you can prevent attackers from easily moving laterally. So if they compromise one segment, they can't automatically access the entire network.
Ah, so it's like compartmentalizing the ship. If one compartment gets flooded, the whole ship doesn't sink.
A good analogy. It limits the blast radius of an attack.
Smart. And of course, we have to talk about backups.
Absolutely. Regular backups are your lifeline in a ransomware attack. But the key is they have to be offline backups, meaning they're not connected to your network. If they're connected, the attackers can encrypt them too.
Right, so store them on a separate device or in the cloud, but make sure they're not constantly synced.
Exactly. And don't forget to test your backups regularly. Make sure you can actually restore your systems from them. You don't want to find out they're corrupted when it's too late.
That's a good point. It's like having a fire escape but never checking if it actually works. Not a good idea. Finally, what about the people? I mean, technology is important, but what about the human element?
User training and awareness are essential. Your employees are often the first line of defense. They need to be aware of the risks. They need to know how to spot phishing emails. They need to understand the importance of strong passwords and proper data handling. A well-informed workforce is a much harder target for attackers.
Okay, so it's a multi-layered approach. Secure your systems, monitor your logs, segment your network, have good backups, and train your people. It sounds like a lot, but it's all essential.
It is. But the good news is, a lot of these best practices, they're not just for defending against Akira. They're fundamental cybersecurity principles that will protect you against a wide range of threats.
That's reassuring. So to kind of sum up what we've learned today, Akira ransomware, it's been active since at least March 2023. It uses this double extortion tactic, encrypting data and then threatening to release it if you don't pay. They usually get in through compromised credentials, they move around using a mix of off-the-shelf tools and their own custom malware, and they specifically target high-value data. And they seem to have connections to other cybercriminal groups, like Conti.
That's a good summary. It's a serious threat, no doubt about it. But by understanding how they operate and by taking the right steps to protect yourself, you can significantly reduce your risk.
Well said. I think the big takeaway here is the threat landscape is constantly evolving. Akira is just one example of how sophisticated these attackers are becoming. We can't just sit back and rely on the same old security measures. We have to be proactive, we have to stay informed, and we have to be prepared to adapt.
I completely agree. Complacency is the enemy in cybersecurity.
And I think it's really interesting, how they're focusing on data exfiltration now. It's not just about disrupting operations, it's about stealing valuable information and using that as leverage. It makes you
Hmm.
think, what are the crown jewels in your own organization? What data would be most damaging if it fell into the wrong hands? And are you doing enough to protect it?
That's a great point to leave our listeners with. It's not just about keeping the bad guys out anymore. It's about protecting what matters most, even if they do manage to get in. Food for thought, for sure.
Absolutely. All right, well, on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, everyone, and stay safe out there in the digital world.
Thanks for having me.